Eric Salahab here again, and this is part two of why we lecture and why we shouldn't. And so, if you are watching this and you haven't watched part one, close this out, go back and find part one and watch that first. I hope you had fun thinking about your identity and why you lecture, because that's what teachers do. And now we're going to move on and consider some other reasons why we lecture. I want to reframe you with this transmission of knowledge paradigm. This is where teachers are the content experts, the sages on the stage who have that important content and those skills that they really want to demonstrate to students, and students are those passive recipients, more or less, of that knowledge. And again, I want to focus on the primary, if we're talking about transmitting knowledge, knowledge consists of facts, content, it's the topics, it's the, that important stuff in our discipline. Skills are important here too, but we tend to lecture about facts, content, and topics. And because we think the content is important, we're lecturing to help students learn the content. There's a lot of content in our class, and lectures are the best way to get through the material, to get the facts across, to cover the topics. I have heard variations on this reason many times from faculty across the disciplines. And again, I would just like you to sit back and think, does this resonate with you? Do you have a lot of content to cover? When you start class with those slides, are you really doing what I'm doing and looking and seeing I'm on slide 29 and I won't tell you how many I have left, but I'm looking at the clock and wondering how fast do I need to click? You know what covering content is. It's getting through the material. It's going over the topics. This is where we're showing PowerPoint slides. We're up at the board working problems, or we're up at the front doing a demonstration, or we're walking around, but we're doing the demonstration and doing the talking, and we're offering the examples, and we're telling stories. And so that's what I mean by covering content. And why do we do it? Because the content is really important, and students are simply incapable, or at least unwilling, to do the work they would have needed to do outside of class to gain currency with the content. And so since they can't or won't do that outside of class, we've got to do it in class, right? Does this resonate with you, or to what extent? We don't trust students to do the work, so we need to transmit the knowledge to them in class. Just a quote here from Samuel Johnson, and I think this is mid-1700s. I don't have an exact date. He says, lectures were once useful, but now when all can read and books are so numerous, lectures are unnecessary. Well, good food for thought, Samuel Johnson. Back in the day, when there was one book, clearly students needed that content. They can't study at home because they don't have the book. There's no internet. There's no other expert. If the knowledge exists in the book or in the lecturer's head or in the cadaver that I have and no one else has one, then that lecture is crucial. But our students have books. They have the internet. They have YouTube. They have Khan Academy. They have a practically endless supply of information. And so why are we still lecturing? Well, according to Graham Gibbs, and I'll talk more about Gibbs and the book, this is actually a quote from his, not really a book, an essay called 20 Terrible Reasons to Lecture, where he looks at a lot of reasons why we lecture and he critiques them. And so we're going to talk quite a bit about Gibbs today, whenever you're watching this. So he says this: there's no significant difference between lecturing and a host of other methods to help students learn factual material. And I think those of us who are fans of lectures should write this down. There's at least one thing that lectures, based on their research, are as good pretty much as anything else. Just getting students to learn factual content. Now, they're not better, Gibbs says, right? They're not better than other methods, but they're as good. Except, he says, there is some evidence that unsupervised reading is actually better than lecturing. So again, I think you might want to go back to that Samuel Johnson quote. If students reading on their own is just as good, and maybe even a little bit better than a lecture at getting those facts across, why are we lecturing? And students have trouble paying attention for very long. I tried to validate this diagram, which I have seen everywhere, and I saw both some evidence for it. I also saw some critiques of this, that there are variables that might extend or actually shrink down this attention window. But I think it probably rings true to most of us that our ability to actually focus on one thing is limited. And maybe it lasts 10 minutes or 15 minutes and starts tailing off. And maybe there are things that we can do or students can do to extend this. But nonetheless, if we're lecturing for very long, students are going to struggle to pay attention. And if our goal is to transmit knowledge to them, then they need to be paying attention. Dr. James Lang wrote a great book called Small Teaching a couple of years ago, and he says lectures, they attend to low-level outcomes. And I don't think he was being derogatory. Low-level outcomes on Bloom's taxonomy are pretty darn important. Those are the recall of the facts and the basic concepts, maybe the ability to kind of explain these concepts and facts. If students can't do those things, they won't be able to climb up the taxonomy and do those more important, higher-level cognitive tasks. But Dr. Lang says lectures can only or tend to only focus on these lower level outcomes. Well, I think we would probably agree that's true. We're lecturing because we don't think students can do the reading or look at the slides themselves, and our slides and lectures tend to focus on the facts and the content. And so here we have Dr. Eric Mazur from Harvard. He's a physicist. And if you want to watch a fun YouTube video later at some point, just Google him or go to YouTube and look up Confessions of a Converted Lecturer. Dr. Mazur used to lecture, and his students liked it, and he was pretty satisfied because they were doing well on the exams. And he often lectures Harvard pre-med students in physics. The problem is he found out that even though his lectures enabled his pre-med students to pass the exams and do fine working the problems, he learned that even though he had covered the concepts, for instance, of Newtonian mechanics thoroughly, and his students could work the problems, he realized that they didn't really understand Newtonian mechanics. They could rotely apply the formulas because they had memorized the formulas and they could get the right answer. But they didn't understand the concepts, and so they still had an Aristotelian naive conception of physics, even though they could do the Newtonian problems. And for Mazur, this was not good. He's training doctors, and he really wanted them to be critical thinkers. He realized that this was focused on those low-level, the facts and the application of the formula, but they weren't actually understanding the concepts that he cared about. And so Mazur says this, we, teachers, put all the emphasis on the easy part when we lecture, the transmission of information. That's the easy part. Now, it may not be easy, but it's the easiest thing that students have to learn in that class, the basic information. And when we lecture in class, we are putting our focus, and we're doing the work in class on the easiest thing. And we leave it, he says, to the students to do the harder thing, right? Assimilating the information and using it. Mazur points out that most of the learning is happening outside of the classroom, right? They need the content in order to do the higher level thinking. And so if class time is spent delivering content, you're clearly leaving the higher level thinking for students to do outside of the class. And he just finds this an interesting conundrum. You've got a limited amount of precious class time. Your students are spending, in theory, 2 to 3 hours outside of class studying for every hour in class, which means that class time that they have with you is pretty darn important. it's the time where you and your students overlap. It's a third of the time that they're working independently. And so I think Mazur is asking us to think about, how should we use this precious class time? And so this is the end of part 2 of why we lecture and why we shouldn't. And so I would like you to, take a few minutes to think about what we've talked about, or what I've talked about, the knowledge that I've transmitted to you in the last 10 minutes, and do some free writing about it. Maybe you've got some questions, maybe you've generated some ideas. We've talked about one of the main reasons we lecture is to deliver content to students, because that content is so important. And we've looked at a couple of critiques of that reason. And so to whatever extent you found resonance with the need to cover content in class, what do you think of the criticisms raised by Graham Gibbs and the attention span, and Eric Mazur, and Dr. James Lang? And so take a few minutes to think and write about that, and I will see you for part 3.